friends. I am Vivian McPeak, and you are listening to Hemp Present. If you have feedback or would like to suggest a guest or topic for Hemp Present, email me at hempresent@gmail.com. Mark Taylor-Canfield is a musician and journalist in Seattle. He's a former writer at Huffington Post and serves as executive director for Democracy Watch News. Mark is a frequent contributor to one of my favorite shows, the Thom Hartmann program, and a weekly guest on the Jeff Santos Show, broadcasting from Boston. He just found out he was accepted into the prestigious modern journalism program at New York University. As an advocate for press freedom, he has briefed members of Congress on challenges to freedom of the press and participated in major international conferences focusing on democracy and press freedom. He has joined me today to talk about this very sobering and critical subject. Welcome back, Mark, to Cannabis Radio.
Oh, great to be with you again, Vivian. It's been a while. Always appreciate talking with you.
Yes, man, absolutely. Mark, in this information age, governments, political institutions, powerful corporations, fundamentalist theocracies, and organized crime have increasingly repressed the people's right to advance their opinions and expose acts of corruption and violence, or more often human rights violations. Right now, only an estimated 13% or 1 in 7 people in the world enjoy freedom of the press. But our digital age has also made it much easier for virtually anyone to record, publish, and broadcast information and activities depending on where they are. Before we dive into specifics, generally, in your opinion, how important is the existence of free and unfettered media for democracies? How big of an issue is this?
Well, I will quote Walter Cronkite, one of my heroes, who said in his book, Life of a Reporter, that freedom of the press is not just important for democracy, it is democracy. And for some reason in this country, we have a very apathetic press, especially the corporate media, but even some of the progressive media have refused to cover some of these issues that I've been lobbying them over the last few years about. And so I think, we as Americans, we as North Americans, at least in the United States, we need to figure out, we need to go back to a basic pro-democracy movement, I think, in this country and start rethinking where we came from, the reason for the original revolution against the British Empire. And freedom of the press was one of the main issues, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. And one of the reasons why some of the states finally decided to join on to that Constitution, to sign on, was the Bill of Rights, which was based partly on English law. And, there were multiple revolutions in England, and the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, that also included some of these ideas, not all of them, but some of them. And freedom of the press is the basic foundation of any democracy. So if you don't have a free press, and that means a diverse free press, if you don't have freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press, you do not have democracy. And unfortunately, as Reporters Without Borders have pointed out in their latest report released on World Press Freedom Day, kind of the focus of my year was May 3rd, they report that freedom of the press is under duress and being attacked all over the planet. It is not a good time, unfortunately, for journalists right now in countries all over the world. There are big crackdowns on press freedom in some of the major developing countries like China and Russia, but there are also a lot of problems in the United States, which no one here seems to want to address. And Kudos to you, Vivian. I've known you for years. You've been a major part of the community and done some very, very important work, and I really appreciate that. And the fact that you're bringing this issue to your program just shows that you are one of the very few people in the corporate media landscape and in all of the media in the United States that is actually willing to take on some of these issues. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's been an uphill battle trying to get these issues out on other media. So thanks so much. I appreciate that.
You bet, Mark. Marcus, May of this year, over 37,000 people, mostly almost all Palestinians, only 1,400 of that being Israelis, have been killed in the Israel-Hamas war, if you could call it a war, including 105 journalists, 100 Palestinian, 2 Israeli, and 3 Lebanese. And that's probably needs to be updated by now already. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Israel-Hamas conflict's been the deadliest period of war for journalists in the 24th century, And in January this year, the head of the Committee to Protect Journalists stated that Israel's war in Gaza is more deadly to journalists than any previous war. This is an issue that you put a lot of focus on. What's your general take on all this, and what do you have to report on this issue of violence against journalists?
Well, that has been one of my main issues this year. It has been, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the most dangerous conflict for journalists since they started keeping statistics over 30 years ago. And the number of 108 journalists, 103 Palestinian journalists being killed, those are preliminary reports, by the way. So we know that the numbers are much larger than that. And one of the problems, of course, is that there have been not only attacks on media centers, and the Israeli government actually shut down Al Jazeera's office in Israel, but they have also made it almost impossible for journalists to enter some of those areas. So we don't really know what's going on, Vivian. We estimate, and all of these groups, Reporters Without Borders, the Committee to Protect Journalists, are doing stellar work on these issues, but they're very limited. They have limited budgets as nonprofits, just like my organization, Democracy Watch News. So we have limitations on what we can do and the information that we have access to. But as far as we know today, at least 108 journalists have been killed. And, there have been attempts by Reuters and the United Nations and others to approach Israel and the Israel Defense Forces to try to get assurances that journalists will not be targeted. Of course, the IDF claims they're not being.
Of course,
but
they always claim that stuff.
Yeah, and it's also not the first time that journalists have been targeted during war conflicts. It was happening in Iraq, which was one of the kind of censored, uncovered stories. There was a great documentary by PBS Frontline on that. But journalists, ever since General Westmoreland in the Vietnam War said, we got to keep journalists off the front lines because they might, quote, misinterpret what they see, unquote. There's been an attempt to keep journalists out of conflict zones. And since the attrition rate is so high right now in Gaza, it's impossible to fill those ranks, to replace those journalists. There just aren't enough trained people who are willing to go into a place like that. I mean, my heart goes out to all war correspondents, the issues they have to deal with PTSD and all sorts of things. I remember Christopher Hitchens, told me one time, or Chris Hedges told me one time, he said, don't be a war correspondent, Mark, because you'll never be able to sleep and you'll drink too much, that kind of thing. People do kind of get addicted, unfortunately, to the danger. We've all experienced that, in the middle of, being shot with rubber bullets and things at a protest. But it's a very, very dangerous place. And the fact is that nobody is willing to say. The UN has raised concerns over the killings of journalists in Gaza. And, in a statement, they said that they were, quote, alarmed at the extraordinarily high numbers of journalists and media workers who've been killed, attacked, injured, and detained in the occupied Palestinian territory, especially in Gaza. But there have been no assurances that media will be protected or that they will be safe in that zone. So there is no protection. And that is one of the major hashtags that the Committee to Protect Journalists has been promoting this year, and that is the hashtag not a target. Journalists should never be a target. They should never be, attacked. The right to cover an armed conflict and the right to report home to the people, trying to watch these conflicts is very, very important. It's our public duty and obligation to do that. So the fact that the IDF cannot guarantee the safety of journalists, even though the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has called for an end to the longstanding pattern of impunity in the cases of journalists killed by the IDF, it's still a very dangerous situation, and there's been no resolution to that whatsoever. Right now, we just can't replace the number of journalists who are being killed there. So we're not going to know exactly what's actually going on in Rafah or Gaza right now, because there's no one to tell you.
Right. There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth, and it seems that sadly includes those who report it. And this is going on in other places. Thom Hartmann's had Philip Ittner who's in Ukraine doing some amazing reporting as well. And we're just in a very disturbing time in not only in the world, in this country. We got to go to break, so I'm going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back with our second segment with Mark Taylor-Canfield.
Time to roll out for the people that let us Hemp Present. Hang loose. We're coming right back.
We're back on Hemp Present with Mark Taylor-Canfield. Mark, another disturbing trend is the specific targeting of journalists working and living in exile. It's one thing to be in a war zone and be killed or maimed or injured, but it's another thing to be in another entire different country, right, and be targeted. Currently, there are increasing numbers of people immigrating to flee repression. As new technologies have made it easier for exiles to stay connected to their countries and amplify their voices, governments are increasingly reaching beyond their borders to employ various tactics, including direct attacks and assassinations, like we saw in the case of Khashoggi back in 2018, who was murdered and dismembered by Saudi operatives, government operatives. What are your thoughts on the targeting of journalists who are in exile?
Well, this is another issue that Reporters Without Borders and also the Committee to Protect Journalists has been doing great work on. And I know it's a story that doesn't really get covered in the United States, just like another issue which we should address at some point, which is our own steadily declining ranking on the World Press Freedom Index in this country, because we have our own problems. But according to Reporters Without Borders, 779 journalists were jailed in 2023. And so it's an increasing problem. There's definitely problems in China and other places where media is being cracked down on. We have American journalists who are actually in jail in places like Iran and Russia. So American journalists right now are behind bars in other countries. And so it's a problem for everyone. And I think it just goes back to the whole issue that Reporters Without Borders was talking about in their recent report, which is that it's been a very difficult time for journalists around the world in many countries. There have been, some improvements. Some countries are doing quite well. We could also talk about them in terms of the juxtaposition between nations that are cracking down on their journalists and trying to keep them from reporting politically sensitive information. But there are also countries who have a long-standing tradition of supporting journalism and are up towards the top of the World Press Freedom Index list. But yeah, there are U.S. Journalists actually in jail in other countries right now, and negotiations are going on to free them. And I think it's important that all of us, all journalists, continue to report on those incidences, to get the word out, make sure that everybody knows what's happening and that the information can't just disappear.
Right.
So if people don't know about this particular story, but a citizen both of the United States and Iran, Roxana Saberi, was initially arrested for illegally purchasing wine, but later her charges in Iran got changed to being charged with espionage. So she's one of the people who are currently in jail. And this has been going on for years now, where all around the country, in Russia and in Iran and others, American journalists actually get arrested and then are held on local charges. So there are several people that we've been keeping track of. And there's also been, deaths of journalists in some of these countries as well. So we're hoping, that they will all be safe and at least survive their detainment, because that's also an issue. So just to know, if you want to find out more about some of these cases, you can go to democracywatchnews.org, which is my organization. You can also go to the Committee to Protect Journalists Reporters Without Reporters Without Borders, and keep the information out there and keep these people alive. I mean, the more that we focus on them and their names and what's happening to them, then the more pressure there is on the local and national governments in those countries to bring them before some kind of public trial and keep them above board where we can keep an eye on them. What we don't want is people disappearing. That's also something that's happened in other countries. But yes, it is a problem, whether they're indigenous reporters who in Brazil or reporters from the United States and other countries, Reuters reporters, AP reporters, they're all under threat. And even in the United States, there was an Al Jazeera reporter who just the other day was threatened with arrest, just like I have been many times for refusing to leave the area of a protest where people were being arrested. And the police made it very clear that everyone in this area, this was during a sit-in at the Israeli consulate in New York City. I believe it was in New York City. No, San Francisco, actually. I'm sorry. And the Al Jazeera reporter was threatened with arrest by the police just for being there. So that's something that happens in the United States, and it's happened to me and other journalists. It's happened to Amy Goodman, where the police just, arrest you just for being there and refusing to leave the area. And of course, we feel like it's our obligation to document the arrest of the people and their treatment by the police as they're being taken into custody. So we're, usually willing to risk our own arrest in order to get that documentation. There's always this trade-off, of course, because if they arrest you and then they take your camera, et cetera, and there's a delay in your reporting, then eventually the information might get out, but it may be delayed as, they process you, So there's this trade-off there. But that happens quite often, and that happened just the other day at the Israeli consulate.
Along the lines of what you're just talking about here in the United States in its digital age, we have the rise of citizen journalists, as we saw like with Occupy and the Black Lives Matter movements. And this is happening simultaneously while traditional newsrooms have seen massive cutbacks and mainstream media has been pretty much just like completely taken over by corporate big moneyed interests. And one aspect of the digital citizen journalist phenomenon has been the so-called First Amendment auditors, a mostly American phenomenon and a form of citizen journalism that involves filming in public spaces to, quote, test constitutional rights covered by the First Amendment. They tend to film in government buildings or spaces and are sometimes pretty confrontational, taunting staff or public officials in order to generate content to upload to social media platforms. Some people are concerned that these provocative actions might result in oppressive legislation, which seeks to roll back some First Amendment rights. There's a new Louisiana law making it a crime to approach within 25 feet of a law enforcement officer under certain circumstances. And Ron DeSantis signed a similar measure into law in Florida last April, and Arizona just made it illegally to knowingly film a police officer from 8 feet or closer if an officer told him to stop. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, I'm having flashbacks to a student protest. A bunch of high school students were protesting the election of Donald Trump, the selection by the Electoral College of Donald Trump, and
a good thing to protest.
Yeah, they were treating a young woman very brutally and holding onto her arm while directly pepper spraying her in the face so that she couldn't get away or protect herself. And then they were, took her down in a pretty violent arrest. So I was told by the police officer, step up on the sidewalk, because this was happening actually on the street during a march. And so I did step up on the sidewalk, still, of course, trying to film the arrest. Usually they surround the person being arrested, so you can't film them even if you are close. But, I was probably, 5 feet away from the officer or something and got pepper sprayed directly in the face. And that's another way that journalists are dealt with, is that you tear gas them, you throw a concussion grenade at them, you pepper spray them. If you don't arrest them, you find other ways of derailing their reportage. And, we know as reporters that a lot of times police are worried that the news media footage will be used against them and, during court proceedings. if
George
they're
Floyd.
sued. Yeah, so sometimes I don't like that. And in some extreme cases, like a protest in Washington D.C., where my friends Jeff and Carrie were at, they just literally smashed their camera. So there's that. And at a case in I believe it was at UCLA, they actually just arrested the cameraman and then forgot that. You can go to my YouTube channel and see this video. They actually arrested a cameraman and then didn't realize that his camera was still live streaming the whole thing.
Nice.
So the police, finally eventually find his camera and pick it up and carry it around. So you get to see kind of like the fly on the walls view of what's going on. But yeah, I mean, it all comes down to a couple. You mentioned a couple things there. You mentioned
we got to go to break, Mark.
Okay,
so hold that thought, man, and we'll be right back with our last segment.
Time to roll out for the people that let us present. Hang loose. We're coming right back.
We're back for our final segment with Mark Taylor-Canfield. Mark, I want to give you a chance to talk about your covering of World Press Freedom Day and give some final thoughts. But real quickly, also on social media, we're seeing an increasing disinformation campaigns as domestic and foreign influence actors like European-based troll farms, Eastern European and others, the fomenting this proliferation of fake accounts and satire pages, quote satire pages that crank out mostly culture war-oriented memes containing outright lies aimed at stoking political and cultural divisions. And there's just a general distraction from what I call information poisoning, Instagram and TikTok, and just people being distracted by meaningless stuff that's just taking up so much of the oxygen in the media room. Are you concerned about this emerging phenomenon and its corruptive influence on society in general, and especially our chance to get real information out there, important information?
Well, believe me, at all these major conferences that I go to and webinars and things that we participate in, there are three major issues that come up every single time that are on everybody's minds right now. And this included a civics club presentation there in Seattle, a city club presentation there in Seattle about AI. So there are three things that we talk about at every conference. One is cybersecurity, because journalists also get attacked, cyber attacks. So cybersecurity is a very important thing. You also have AI and its influence
and that's what
on
these troll farms
media.
are, right? They're generated by AI.
Yes, and then the third that leads to disinformation. So how do we, as journalists, sort through the information and alert people to the disinformation? And how do you deal with a story in your supposedly objective, suit as a journalist, when you know that one side is completely lying to you? So
double-sidism is another real problem here, right?
Yeah.
This idea that you have to give both. It's like, man, I don't have to give both sides of Nazis.
Well, the story that I always repeat is, if two people are talking to you, one person says it's raining like crazy and terrible out, and the other person says it's sunny, and you look out the window and it's sunny, then just report that it's sunny, okay?
Right. I want to give you a chance.
Don't bother with all the nonsense. It just takes us away from the real issues we need to be covering.
Right. Is it sunny or not? I want to quickly. You've been covering World Press Freedom Day. We only have about 2 minutes.
World Press Freedom Day is the focus of my journalist year, and as executive director for Democracy Watch News. So I spend the whole year lobbying other media in the United States, including so-called progressive media, who I'm very disappointed with in a lot of ways. My job is to lobby them to cover World Press Freedom Day, to announce that it's happening. It's been designated by the United Nations, for years now, and it's nothing new. But in the United States, we don't tend to report on it or talk about it or even announce that it's happening. So there are major conferences sponsored by the United Nations this year. It was in Argentina, in Santiago, but it's been a major focus for journalists all over the world every year. Unfortunately, I have to report that this year, not only did corporate and progressive media not report on it at all, they also failed to report on the fact that the United States is now ranked 55th in the world. Yes, that's number 55 in terms of press freedom by Reporters Without Borders on the 2024 World Press Freedom Index. And that's largely due to something you mentioned before, which is corporate media consolidation, ownership consolidation. You can read my article, Truth Out, about that. And also, yes, the fact that there are some very wealthy people who are controlling a lot of the media and a lot of the social media right now who have very focused political agendas, and they're using media for that purpose. Of course, that's not new. William Randolph Hearst did the same thing when he tried to drum up a war with Spain. So, it's happening again. And the fact that no media in the United States, except for you and Thom Hartmann and Democracy Watch News and a few other people, Truth Out, most of them, even Rolling Stone and Mother Jones and all the so-called progressive media, refuse to report on this issue. And so it's very frustrating for me as a journalist to know, and embarrassing as a journalist to know that my country is ranked 55th in the world. Costa Rica is ahead of us. Zambia and Namibia, some West African countries are ahead of us. There are some countries where it's doing very well.
I just want to say this is happening while right-wing dictatorial authoritarian fascism is on the march across the world and right here in America, man. And to use a very crude journalistic phrase, we're in deep shit, man. Mark,
it's like the 1930s. Yeah, we can't go down that road again, folks. We've already been there.
No, we can't. How can people follow your stuff, Mark?
You can go to my YouTube channel and see my MTC report. You can also hear me on the Thom Hartmann Show and see my articles at democracywatchnews.org. And then I'm also a musician and with a rock band, so my music is also all over social media and on Spotify, Facebook, Instagram, all of that. So you can check out my music as well and my music videos at YouTube.
Mark Taylor-Canfield, thank you so much, man, for all the amazing work you're doing, my brother. I look forward to seeing you again in person.
Yes, it would be great to do this again and touch on some of those other subjects. And I appreciate what you're doing as well. Keep it up.
We can do another show and dial down on some stuff. All right, take care, bro.
Peace out, man.
That concludes this installment of Hemp on Cannabis Radio. When it comes to prohibition, you got the right not to remain silent. Activism requires a voice. Find your voice. Speak up for justice because resistance is fertile. The Hemp Present intro music is 7 Mile Beach by Joanne Rand, and the outro music is Take Back the Plant by Stickerbush. See you next time. Stay strong. Marijuana!